This is a rare opportunity we have to address perhaps the biggest generational change in Montana history, a period of transformational change, kind of a quiet revolution from 1959 through 1989. Those 30 years were massive changes in Montana. And the person we're going to be speaking with today was in the middle of that change for the entire 30 years, and that's former Governor Ted Schwinden, who started in the legislature in 1959 and left after 2 terms as governor in 1989 and played a critical role during that whole period. And so it's such a great pleasure to have the opportunity to get his reflections on that history. And Ted, Governor Ted, friend Ted, let's start with 1959 when you first came to Helena in the legislature and what your reflections were on that.
Right. Well, it really started in '58 when I unexpectedly won an election as a freshman Democrat out of Roosevelt County. And you're right, I left office in 1989, and when I did that, I basically left the world of politics and became once again a historian, because from the time I was in elementary school, I loved history. And one of the things that happened after I left office is I more and more look back on exactly what you've talked about, Evan, which is that the way I would put it is that if a former legislator from the 1930s or 40s or 50s would have stopped into the House or Senate in 1959, they'd have felt totally comfortable. Nothing much had changed, except we had electronic voting by 1959. But you've stated it, I think, very well in terms of the context in which I've looked at what happened in those years, and as an observer, and sometimes as a participant in a few instances. But as I've thought about it, Evan, the change really began in World War II. Mm-hmm. And I think any future historian who's doing a master's degree on this period we're talking about is going to have to look back to that incredible period right after World War II, when some, 14 to 15 million young Americans who survived that horror of those war years came home to not just the United States, but to Montana. And they brought back one dramatic change, something like the PSD that now has become characteristic of the mm-hmm. Afghanistan situation. They were changed. They didn't know it at the time, but golly, we'd been all over the world. We'd been in Southeast Asia and the Philippines. We'd been in Europe, and we'd been in Germany and Italy and North Africa. These young Americans coming home. And they were not the same kids who came out of the schools in Wolf Point and Libby and Webo and Kremlin and all of those communities in Montana. They had seen the cultures of the world, and it had an impact. But even that dwarfs in significance to the passage of the GI Bill. Mm-hmm. We came back as young Montanans to have an opportunity to go to college. I don't know, Evan, but I have a feeling that neither my brother or I would have been able to go to college, coming off that farm in northeast Montana. He went on to become a doctor in economics, PhD, and I had a great education in both Montana and the University of Minnesota. And so we had not only a lot of young people who came back from the war whose culture, attitude was different, but all of a sudden they could go to school. Mm-hmm. And we then, I guess, in my opinion, we began to realize the old Jeffersonian dream, which I'm sure you're familiar with. He said, our republic doesn't survive without an educated citizenry. Yeah. And that's what those years after World War II did. And that played over into this period that we are going to talk primarily about today, which is what happened in about that period of 59, 60, and 61 that began the transformation.
Yeah, and you served 2 sessions in the legislature, right?
Yes, 2 sessions.
2 sessions.
Then it got beat.
Yeah. Now, Francis Bardno was such a good friend of yours that came when you did.
Yes.
Did you reflect on Francis a little bit, and then we can bridge out into what was happening?
Well, we met the night of the Democratic caucus in January of '59. I was circulating around the room, and I ran into this fellow with a rich plaid shirt and a pair of Levi's and cowboy boots that had been worn, on a horse, and it began a friendship that lasted until he finally died after he left the legislature. He became, if not the most long-serving legislator, he would be close to it. Maybe
Dave Manning was probably the longest,
Dave Manning
but
maybe
other
was
than
longer.
that, yeah.
But he always played a key role because he was appointed to the Appropriations Committee in 1959 and continued to, and I'm going to use this word advisedly, he ruled over it, sometimes to the frustration of other members of the legislature. And I was the best man at his wedding. I mean, we were just good friends, that's all. So, no, Francis played a role, and I'm more comfortable talking about this period of time of him because Francis and I would sit around the breakfast table while Gene cooked breakfast at our house here in Helena, and we'd talk about retrospectively what was happening. So, no, Francis was a good friend throughout my entire political career.
It was interesting that there was a period of 16 years after World War II, starting with Aronson as governor, and he served 2 terms, and then Nutter was elected, and before he was tragically died in the plane wreck. But with that, you had another 2 terms. So you had 16 years of Republican governors,
Right.
Which were followed by 20 years of Democratic governors, of which you were the final 8 years. Right. And it would appear that there were some major forces at work in terms of the desire for change from the control of the Anaconda Company and the special interests of the state, such as they would be, to more of a people orientation of government and government that wasn't hidden from them, and so on. I wondered if you might, reflect on that a little bit.
Well, first, I have to make a confession, because as a freshman legislator, I really didn't recognize that a change was already just barely beginning in '59, because in retrospect, a few years later, I could recognize that the historical alliance that had played such a tremendous role in Montana history, the Anaconda Company, the Montana Power Company, and the Montana Stock Growers, who, it was a loose coalition that continued to particularly have the ability to kill or change legislation. But that coalition, I believe now that probably it already started in '59, and by '61, my second and last session in the legislature, there were differences in the way they no longer always cooperated on issues before the legislature, particularly the 2 big corporate outfits.
And in '59, of course, was the year that the Anaconda Company actually sold the newspapers that they controlled, most of the state newspapers.
Good comment, because that moves us right into the next thing that began to change Montana, and this one is significant. When Anaconda sold the newspapers, really for the first time, Montana had virtually statewide independent newspapers. The Tribune, the Great Falls Tribune, had always been the closest thing to an independent paper in its editorial and news coverage and so forth. And the wire services like AP and UPI basically handled the day-to-day news. But once the Anaconda newspapers converted over or sold, maybe in part because what was happening at the national level in terms of what later become the Nixon scandals and the work of Woodward and Bernstein, a group of young journalists emerged in Montana, and they were remarkable. I once wrote an article for the Montana Magazine in which They had asked us to identify the most important factors in Montana's history. And I listed Chuck Johnson and
Jerry Holleran.
yeah, Jerry Holleran, Dale Burke over in Missoula, and
Dan
then ultimately
Foley.
Dan Foley, who's the one that brought down the, in a way, the sales tax initiative. And that period of very aggressive reporting, was certainly there when I was in the land department many years later, because they, with the squabble going over the development of coal industry in Montana, they began to play a very aggressive role down at the land department, checking on how the mining was going, how many fines had been made, and all that sort of thing. So independent journalism, and I'll say it right now, Evan, I don't believe you can have good government without aggressive, hard-nosed investigative journalism. And I guess I'd have to say that as I look at Montana papers today, I wish they were a little more aggressive. Media keeps government
honest,
so
to speak. Yeah.
It's that. Yeah. That's the blunt way to put it, and probably a little bit harsh. But what I saw in this 30 years that we're going to talk about, and we're talking about now, is that they played a critical role in what ultimately made it possible for 20 years of Democratic governors.
Mm-hmm. And if you think about it, the control of the press, I mean, if you don't have that free investigation, the free flow of information, how does the citizenry act in an informed manner in terms of elections and so on?
Well, I don't want to call it the collapse of the GOP in the '68 election, but in reality, it was close to that. An old friend of mine, Harry Fritz, a professor over at the University of Montana, wrote a really great chronicle, a paper, a historical paper on the impact of the '68 election, focused very much or almost entirely on the issue of the sales tax before the public. And since we're just coming out of this discussion of aggressive newspapering, at that time, the newspaper chain had a reporter called Dan Foley. And apparently, in looking into the back rooms of corporate government, or corporate in Montana, was able to dig out the amount of money that was being contributed to this organization, that an old PAC, I guess is what you'd call it in modern day terms, that funded SOS, which was Save Our State, the concept of a statewide sales tax, finally making Montana have a three-wheel stool. So we had not only income and property, but we had a sales tax. And the overwhelming failure of that initiative in 1968.
68, just as a matter of course, 68 was, my recollection of it was in '67, the legislature had a big battle over the sales tax.
Right.
Gene Mahoney was in the Senate, and the Democrats in the Senate stopped it when Jim Felt and the Republicans were pushing it. Babcock ran in '68 on the sales tax, and Forrest ran on the basis of pay more, what for? And that was, but then they kept bringing it back, and it was in the '71 session that they brought in a ballot issue, the referendum on the ballot, fall of '71. And the SOS effort, which was the Save Our State, which was the sales tax group, and the cost effort, Citizens Opposed to Sales Tax, which Harry Billings headed up. Harry Billings headed that up, and that was mainly the AFL-CIO, the Farmers Union, and the Democratic Party were the main drivers behind that. And it was in that context that they unveiled the corporate backing. So they had lost the '68 election just on the pure sales tax issue straight up. But the corporate dominance and the corporate imposition of a sales tax really is what Foley did in '71.
Yeah, but it also, even by '78, what it was doing was, one of the spearhead leaders in the legislative level was Jim Lucas from Miles City, who was, clearly one of the leading potential gubernatorial candidates.
Great talent.
A great talent, a great, a very, very talented guy, very good guy. But and I'm sure it hurt other potential Republican candidates too, Evan. I don't know that from being on the inside of that
But it
party.
really kind of killed Lucas's
Killed his
potential
career.
governorship.
Right. He went back to Miles City and served, I believe, as a county attorney, and then I don't know.
He was on the Montana Power Company board for about 25
Oh, was he
years
really?
after
Well,
that.
I met
But,
his
you know,
lovely daughter, and when we were campaigning down in Miles City one time, and probably in 1980, and his young daughter was as nice and good to visit with as could be.
But the sales tax was through 68,
Yeah,
71.
71.
That whole period was an area where that was a very dominant issue.
Well, what the GOP did in '68 was that, I mean, Babcock's theme of his campaign is that the only way we're going to be able to adequately fund Montana, I mean, that originated the pay more what for,
Right.
but I mean, this was the first time that you had a Republican candidate arguing on behalf of a new tax.
Right.
Because it was needed. I mean, it was necessary in order to adequately meet the public service needs of the citizens of Montana. And the combination of those two things really put the GOP at a disadvantage and allowed, as I've already said, the successive elections of Anderson, Judge, and Schwinden.
It was kind of interesting, and I don't want to get into the pure politics of it so much because of, but when Babcock ran in '68 as an incumbent governor, his incumbent lieutenant governor, Ted James, although they didn't run as a team back then, but Ted James ran against him in the primary.
I know.
And the interesting question about whether that divided them or not, but Forrest obviously hit the accord with people with the pay more what for.
Yeah.
You know.
And it seems to me I remember 20's plenty too.
20's plenty.
Plenty,
yeah.
plenty. Okay.
20's plenty was on the reorg. Now let me ask you this, because when Forrest Anderson was elected and came in 1969, he chose you to come in and be the land commissioner.
Right.
How did that happen? In your memory, what was the connection, or was there a connection?
Well, the reality was that the call came in early February out at the farm. It was about 12 below and ground blizzarding and miserable day, and Gordon Bennett called and said that, and very concisely, that the governor was prepared to name me as Commissioner of State Lands, and I sort of reacted to him, and whoa, wait a minute. I mean, I'm on a farm. I mean, a farm isn't something you can just walk away from. And, well, he said, Forrest is not a patient man, and I finally talked Bennett into 24 hours to get back to him to see what I could do in terms of dealing with the farm. We called our closest neighbors, Schwinden Maggie Johnson. The wife, Maggie, was my wife's first cousin. They came down that afternoon, and we explained this whole thing, and really, to my total surprise, Swede, who was not the kind of talker that I am, who talks too much too often, he didn't talk much, but it was meaningful. He totally surprised both Gene and I. He said, if the only thing that is preventing you from accepting the position is the farm, I'll run it for you. And that sealed the deal in effect. Of course, I talked then to the kids, our kids, and they had urged us on. In fact, one of them, and I won't identify that one, said, if you don't do that now, you and Ma are going to be sitting there 40 years from now in lazy boy rockers, recliners, watching television. So we got enthusiastic support from our family, but it was really Swede and Maggie willingness to step in, and we had a panicky day there. Well, after I called Bennett back, trying to put together we had to basically get rid of some equipment, buy all new equipment for the expanded operation, that sort of thing. But that's how it was made. And at that time, the land commissioner was a statutory position, And the term didn't actually begin until April 17th. Was not one of those that come right in with the governor. Later changed, of course, but in executive reorganization. I came up early, a week or so, and Gene and I looked for housing and that kind of thing. And a lot of excitement, but a lot of concern too, because I really didn't know Governor Anderson that well. I had introduced him at a Democratic rally in Wolf Point during that campaign, and basically that was the contact I had with him. I guess I was surprised by the land commissioner because I thought probably, if anything, it'd be agriculture, but it wasn't, and I'm glad that happened the way it did. But that's how I got the appointment. Later on, Gordon and I went over and sat down with the governor, and in a very brief conversation, he told me what was the way he runs government, and I found it satisfactory to my liking, and we built a very good relationship. I'm a Forrest Anderson fan. I think he's one of the people who played an important role over those years.
He seemed to, my recollection of Forrest, and again, I was very young and learning everything back in those days.
Do you remember when you were very young?
Oh, it's hard to sometimes, but fondly.
Okay.
Fondly, including the reorganization, which is where I cut my teeth, working with Duke Crowley and with Forrest and the commission that he set up. But Forrest was very succinct and direct. You really knew where Forrest stood.
Absolutely.
And he always had great
good
advice.
or bad.
Yeah, that's right. So you came on board at a critical time, just as the coal development era was occurring, and that was such an important thing. But tell us a little bit about what happened at the land board, and for example, the checks you were talking about a little bit.
Well, I'm happy to do that.
Go ahead.
But you've already mentioned Duke Crowley, because I think maybe in this terms of this transformational period and how dramatic it was, that next step before the coal thing was the executive reorganization.
Yep.
I mean,
Let's
result of the campaign and the 20s Plenty Pledge. And you correctly identified the key, Duke Crowley, in the whole reorganization process. I mean, obviously under the governor, but Duke basically put it all together with staff help. And I mean, we just can't minimize what happened to the executive branch as a result of executive reorganization, because there was a famous old story of Governor Aronson, who, a Democratic senator, as a friend of mine, told me that he had an exchange with him, and he asked him why the governor didn't do more things, and Governor Anderson replied something to this effect: "I've got 135 boards, bureaus, commissions, and none of them will do what I want them to do." Yeah. I mean, we had a totally disorganized and non-executive government until the reorganization that took place, prior to the whole issue over the coal tax, the reclamation, all those kinds of things.
A case can be made that the dissemination of power in government to these, what we ended up when we did it, counting as we called it 185 boards, bureaus, and commissions by then,
right?
To consolidate that into 20 departments or less, created control, which was what Forrest was getting at.
Okay.
Authority and responsibility that came together. The dissemination of that power through all those boards seemed to almost be a plan to ensure that that government didn't get in the way of the vested and powerful interests of the state of Montana.
But see, there's another factor, and we can't go beyond this, because if executive reorganization had not happened with the election of Governor Anderson, there's some likelihood that it would have been, I'm trying to find a word now, and I probably won't, but see, back in 1957, for the first time, Montana created a legislative body external to the operation of the biennial session, the Legislative Council. Yeah. Which barely survived. A lawsuit was brought against the council, and the state of Montana successfully defended that the constitutional validity of a legislative council operating outside of the sessions. I served on the second one of those legislative councils. And by that time, with its validation by the courts, it began to play a major role. And see, all of these things sort of lead into each other because it wasn't long, and Bardno played a role in this too. What followed the Legislative Council is, they began to feel their oats in the legislature, so they created the Legislative Auditor, and they created the Legislative Fiscal Analyst. If the governor had not pushed through the reorganization, it would have been a continuous weak executive branch and a legislative branch that was getting more important on its own every day. And for the state of Montana, it was that, we're talking again about a very transformational period. All of a sudden, we got strong executive, and we finally got a strong legislature too. And that in itself is like night and day to pre-1958, when I come on board as a prairie farmer out there in eastern Montana. 58 was a sort of a landslide year for legislative candidates who were Democrats, whether they were House or Senate members. And in fact, that year, Democrats held every legislative seat, both House and Senate, from Lincoln County to Roosevelt. We had them all.
Across the whole Highlands.
We had the whole Highland. Of course, we lost them all, most of them next time around, because some of the things that we did in terms of raising taxes to when Governor Aronson left office, he left a budget that was out of balance, not nearly in major terms as we look at them today, but we had to raise some money to in 10, 15 million, something like that. It wasn't a lot of money even in those days. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, but the executive reorganization, again, and that's where I cut my teeth in government first, and I was mentored by Duke Crowley. I mean, what a magnificent opportunity it was for me. And Forrest seemed like he very skillfully got that done. That he, in the '69 session, right after being elected, before it was over, he orchestrated a bill that created a commission that was a bipartisan commission.
Right.
But he would chair, so it was 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, House, Senate, and he would chair it as a vehicle to make it a more palatable thing to have happen. And then the research had to get done under that commission. And in order to force the hand of it in the '69 session, he also orchestrated the passage of the constitutional referendum that said it could be no more than 20 departments.
Yeah, right.
And so while the research was being done, I was hired in August of '69 as an example, while we were doing the research for what went into the '71 session for the bill to implement the 20's plenty, it hadn't been passed yet. So in 1970, in the general election, it was passed overwhelmingly. People said, yes, we want only 20 departments. And suddenly, when he went forward with the bill in '71, he had the backing of a constitutional amendment to kind of force the hand. And even then, there was a lot of opposition to the bill at the time.
Right. But and I can't, even after all these years, I still can't identify all the factors that seem to coalesce. Part of it, I have to go back to a changed culture,
a real
relevant to this,
hunger for change,
a new group of people coming into power, younger people with new ideas and so forth. But the whole thing just began to gain momentum, because that's about the same time we're talking about the Constitutional Convention.
Right.
I mean, as far as I know, no other state was doing something like that. I mean, here's this, relatively low population Western states that all of a sudden is, changing. And, there were different actual instances of things what happened, but throughout that whole period that began sometime maybe after that '68 election, the Montana public seemed to be ready to try something different. It gets that simple. I mean, a farmer always understands that if you try a crop and it turns out to be a failure, you find something else to plant. It's that simple. And I think there was this growing sense in Montana that government could do better than it is.
You know, if the government and politics get too far out in front of the people, it doesn't work.
Right.
It's clear there was a receptive
But you
populace.
can't get behind them either.
That's
you know.
right. And it seems like there was a very receptive populace there
Yeah.
demanding
Yeah.
some things
Yeah.
be different and better.
No.
And I think your identification of that coming out of the World War II generation coming home is, and getting educated.
Yeah, we were all
Yes,
changing.
yeah.
Well, of course, Montana was changing. I mean, I don't remember when we first had a television set out at the farm, but it was, it was much later than,
Yeah.
well, I think there was television probably in '59 session, if I remember right. I think we had a station here in Helena at that
Would have
time.
been brand new, yeah.
Huh? Yeah.
Very, very new,
But,
yeah.
for the first time, Montanans, not just the ones who were the vets, that came out of the war, but people who lived here all of a sudden started seeing the rest of the world
And
in
one-
black and white, but
Yeah, and one change that was kind of imposed upon us as a state by the U.S. Supreme Court was reapportionment. And I remember Dave Manning always saying it should be one cow, one vote. But reapportionment made a big difference at the time. All of a sudden, multiple county districts were formed and the whole structure
Right.
of things were
Right.
different. And was that a significant difference to start with, or did it take time to have impact?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. There was certainly a lot of hostility, particularly in areas like mine where people felt that they weren't. I mean, this whole thing of the parts of Montana that are not a part of the Golden Arc or whatever we call it, that runs from Billings up through Bozeman Butte, Helena, Great Falls, and Kalispell, was beginning to develop. It was clear that more and more they were going to have major input into the legislative process and probably into electing candidates, which is actually what happened. So, yeah, one man vote, conservatives were adamantly opposed to it, and I suspect some of them may be yet today and would like to see something different, but it did change things. There's no question. There's no question.
Forrest ended up modernizing government in
Right.
a lot of ways.
Right.
The Board of Investments.
Right. Right.
Where was
Right.
what were we doing with our money
Yeah, we were giving it to local banks.
for no interest?
Well, I think some
virtually.
probably, but it certainly put us in a much more advantageous position, and I mean, plays an important role, obviously, now too. So,
Again, how you manage your money.
yeah,
And there was special interest stuff at work, or appeared to be at work, about, well, which banks got big deposits and
well, Evan, it isn't only in government, but even in families, change makes people nervous. It's always this thing of, I'm not. I'd like to do better, but I'm not sure that that's the right way to go. And this always is, kind of hangs like a cloud over decision making, and it applies to the public sector too. So, I'm sure that some people worried about an increased executive power in Montana. I think that's probably true. I don't know that I could identify any facts to back that up, but I suspect it happened. I think they grasped the idea that maybe it might work more efficiently than it did before. And, small decisions have big impact, because probably the Department of State Lands, or what became the state lands, might not have survived the Constitutional Convention, but I think he was a Ford dealer from up in Kalispell by the name of Sterling Rigg. Sterling Rigg wound up, I guess, on a committee that was included the Department of State Lands, and we came down and we had a very good visit, very willing to listen and so forth, and I suspect he went back and said, I think we ought to leave him alone with all of the land grant stuff, it's been good historically, so let's continue it, rather than merging it as was later done into the Department of Natural Resources.
And so, and before we get into that coal stuff we were talking about, and talking about executive reorganization, we had the change of governorship, that Forrest wasn't feeling well and decided not to run after only one term. And even though there was a primary among the Democrats and the Republicans, my recollection was Ed Smith ran against Frank Dunkel.
Yeah, I don't.
And Tom Judge ran against Dick DeZivi.
Right.
And Tom, as a lieutenant governor, emerged from that. And when he was elected governor, he ask you to stay on. Can
Right.
you tell us a little bit about that kind of bridge that occurred?
Well, I'm not sure how I can respond to. One of the things that I think caught us by surprise was the number of Anderson people who were asked to stay on. I mean, governors generally like to bring their own people in. That, to a certain extent, didn't happen with Governor Judge. I mean, he left a number of people in place, and I never had an opportunity to visit with Governor Judge about why he chose that, so I don't know. But yeah, I guess I was pleased to continue on. I mean, we'd bought a home and settled here. I enjoyed what I was doing, and like anybody, you got a job you like, you kind of like to stay. But you know, I was surprised, and I think some of the other directors were too, that they were going to be part of the new administration.
There was some interesting continuity there that was not expected,
Right.
I would think. I was at the Democratic Party at the time and stayed there after being on reorganization, but to see that continuity, I was there in the 72 election working with the Democratic Party.
Okay.
I had left reorganization in 71 at
Okay.
the end of the legislature, and our good friend Bill Groff, I remember him championed me.
I remember him
to,
very well too.
And Spike Fuller saying, and Ron saying, and ultimately Forrest said, you go down there and you help out with the Democratic Party, and so I did that for 3 years. But in that period, it was the 72 election. But I was able to observe what I thought was a pretty remarkable continuity that occurred, which probably maybe, since Forrest only had one term, maybe served the people of Montana well, that good people like you stayed on to carry the ball forward on what Forrest was doing.
Somebody else got to make that judgment.
Well,
I don't know.
Yeah.
I do know that Governor Anderson was deeply disappointed that he couldn't run for a second term, but as you and I both know, he had serious health problems that followed surgery, and really never, I mean, it hampered his governorship, and he told me some of the personal stories that verified that. I mean, it's awkward to have a medical situation that is difficult to deal with. So, you know, I have no idea what a second Anderson administration would have been. Maybe he would have replaced more people than Judge. I don't know.
You know. And in your position there, we did move into kind of the coal development period in a way, but you also were asked to head the Bicentennial Commission.
Right.
Which I think was a very interesting thing that, if nothing else, elevated your profile around this state an awful lot, because that was such a big celebration.
Yeah, I mean, I don't remember how much of a big thing it was. I mean, I really don't. We did have obviously a commission that I suspect was appointed by the governor, I guess, and I did chair it. You know, we had a lot of support around the state. There was a lot of enthusiasm for it.
You guys selected Hal Stearns.
Pardon?
You selected Hal Stearns to come
Stearns,
in.
which in itself is part of the revolution. I mean, there are only one Hal Stearns in the
Yeah,
world. So,
yeah.
But anyway, you know, it finally didn't culminate until the Stevens administration, after I left office, with a front of the Capitol ceremony in which I was asked to speak. They probably said briefly, and which I did. I had only said a few lines, but I sat there with Senator Mike Mansfield up on the podium, or the stairs they'd put up there.
Yeah, that was the centennial of Montana, which was soon after the bicentennial of.
Right. Yeah.
And the when you look at the bicentennial committee, I looked at the things that.
Yeah, I mixed the two up.
My observation of your role and some of the things you did, I always thought you were a great idea person in the administration, and I thought you were very seminal in the creation of the Capital for a Day idea, which Governor Judge advanced, and you guys, everyone.
Well, now you're kind of scaring me, Evan, because my good wife of 60 plus years always thought some of my ideas weren't all that good. And I don't know whether that translated into the political spectrum or not, but
maybe she helped you
Jean
sharpen
made
them.
one of the classic. I asked her one time after a speech I'd given in Great Falls or here, I don't know where it was, but I said, "Do you think I talked too long?" And she said, "You've never been criticized for brevity." And the rest of my gubernatorial experience, I remembered that. I did tend to talk probably too much, but anyhow, no. I guess, I mean, the only thing that I remember in terms of my service in government that was uniquely mine is that as Governor Anderson was leaving office, in whatever year that would have been,
73.
72.
70, yeah.
I went up, I got an appointment from Gene, I suppose, Gene Handel, and I went up and we had a little visit, and I said, "Governor, I have an idea, and I'd like to run it by you. It's late, I know, in you're ending your thing," but I said, working in the Department of State Lands and also having studied Montana history and knowing the exploitation of our resources that have had, not just in Butte, but oil and gas, timber, and all of these things in which many and not most of the profits went out. And our ability to tax those industries was always inadequate, in my opinion. So I said, I think that what we ought to do is pass a tax on the gross income of any resource exploitation. Because even if you use gravel up and put it into a foundation, that gravel is gone. Same with the oil, same with the copper, same with the platinum, palladium, all of it. And I said, I mean, it has to be a very small tax because when you start tapping gross, it gets very tough. And I had worked together with the attorney who was working for me at that time, John Henson, who later became a district judge over in Missoula. And I came up with this idea of repaying Montanans for the resources that had already been lost forever. But I couldn't come up with something that made it, not sexy, but at least sort of saleable. And John was the one who suggested, well, he said, in law, indemnification means the repayment of something that was lost. So that's the idea I proposed to Governor Anderson. And I said, what do you think? And he said, sell it to Tom. It's a good one. So then when Governor Judge got elected, maybe even before he began his term, because I'm not sure, but I think he may have included it in his recommendations
We're talking in this case the RIT, the Resource Indemnity
the
Trust.
Resource Indemnity Trust, which at that time was only a statute. And again, that familiar old cowboy up there in Blaine County comes in. As soon as the session was over, a few months later he called and he said, if we don't put this in the Constitution, some future legislature is going to repeal it because there's going to be tremendous corporate pressure to get rid of it, which there was. And as I understand it now, and I don't follow it closely, I think about all that's left is coal and oil. I think most of the other minerals, I think they get platinum, palladium too. But anyway, Tom liked the idea immediately. We got it passed, and I haven't checked, but I understand the $100 million is there and provides interest income to be used in a very broad kind of authorization.
We not only reached the 100 million, but that set the tone, really, in a way, it seemed to me, for the Coal Trust Fund.
Well, there was a good feeling overall about this whole idea. Montana's like that idea of getting something back from our resources.
And the Coal Trust Fund ultimately was passed by the legislature.
Maybe that set a pattern for that too.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Well, my observation is it kind of did because, and out of that, of course, the message was, we lose the resource, and we have had historically nothing to show for it.
Right. Except the people who worked in the mines, whose sons and daughters went on
the jobs, all that was there, but the resource was gone, the money was gone, and so the trust fund, both the RIT, which you created, and the Coal Trust Fund, seemed to me to hold for the future of Montana. I mean, right now, as an example, just the Treasure State Endowment portion of the Coal Trust Fund generates interest to to pay for infrastructure in the state.
Right.
There are all these benefits that came out of what you were talking about.
Well, when you get into those kind of statistics, I mean, that's something that I have not followed up. I mean, we're really talking about the historical impact of a group of factors which changed the state forever.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know about forever. They could always change it back too, I guess.
But it does make it tougher, and Francis was right about that. If you
Right.
embody it,
Right.
if you put it in embed it in the
Right.
Constitution,
Right.
you get the protection from the vagaries
Right.
of some legislature just changing it.
Yeah. Well,
And everyone wants the money.
yeah. Well, we haven't talked about the Constitutional Convention, and really I had no participation in that. And I mentioned the fact that Sterling Rigg came in and talked about whether the Department of State lands ought to be a board, whether it's ought to stay. But otherwise, clearly that was all part of this transformation, and especially in two areas. Environment, which was clearly stressed in the new Constitution, and also the people's right to know. Which has ultimately led me to try to open up state government. I mean, to an extent that I think probably had never happened in the past. I don't think it's happened since I left there. I don't think it's quite as you know. I mean, I basically laid everything bare. Anybody who wanted an appointment had to allow the press in, unless they could come under that exception that says
individual privacy.
The right of privacy, it would intervene. One of the other factors was the college over at the university that somebody had run a poll over there of public attitudes toward government and so forth. And one of the things that they came up with was the sort of alarming low level of trust in government at all. Sort of what we're seeing now. I mean, the whole Tea Party, all that is, I don't trust them anymore. Congress can't do anything. I mean, nobody's looking out for us anymore. And with that level of trust, I thought, my golly, if people don't trust government, we're in big trouble. And that's why I decided, I met with the press before we started, when I started my, got elected as governor, and I said, I intended to open it all up. I mean, I asked them if they wanted to have press meetings, like presidents have, or whether they would rather do individual, and of course they all wanted individual. Big surprise, right? But anyway, I kept my own phone in place, and actually, I mean, people used it. I mean, government tends to be close-lipped, and again, we get back to this thing. Only the media can put enough pressure on, in many cases, to, and we see that over we're not going to talk national, but the current controversy over the NSA and whether they know too much about all of us is a part of whether you trust what they're doing, So
When you were elected governor, and I want to step back to the lieutenant governor thing in a minute, but when you were elected governor with George Terman as your teammate, and you ran on a campaign that was straight talk, good people.
Right.
And when you were elected, my recollection was that, you went from a Lincoln Continental town car for the governor to your own car. You listed your phone number in the phone book. The openness was just what you're talking about, was a big part.
Well, of course, that's who I am.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the way I grew up. I grew in a community where we shared everything. The little local school, the South School that both my wife and I went to for 8 years, one room. Everything was open pretty much. I mean, there were private areas, obviously, but in government, well, let me give you one example. I got a call one time from one of the most remarkable men I've ever met in my life. Interestingly, the head of Montana Power, Paul Schmeckel.
Very much.
He called and asked if he could have an opportunity to meet with me at the mansion, and maybe we could have a good visit. And I said, fine. I said, I'll take you to lunch. And he said, fine. So he came, and we met at the mansion, and then we went downtown to the restaurant down there where basically all of the environmentalists.
Bert and Ernie's? Or was it Big Dorothy's at the time? The windbag.
What is it?
Was it? Where the windbag was.
Windbag, a couple of Wolf Point boys was involved. But anyhow, we go down there, walk in, sit down at a table. And it was,
all eyes were on you.
It was one of the most fun things I've ever done, because here's the governor and the head of the old Montana Power Company with all its background and so forth, and all of it's just packed in there. And every time I look, there's somebody looking over there talking to them.
And they're going,
But
I wonder if
anyway,
I could hear
I
what
mean,
this is. Yeah.
That's symbolism, I know, but I mean, I didn't want to meet with him privately, really, because we had ample opportunity over the table to talk about what his concerns were. But anyway, I just think, I feel so strongly that our growing lack of trust in our institutions, and that's more than one institution, has a tendency to take us down a road that I'm not sure that we could recover in the long run, Evan. I mean, it's serious. Our whole system was founded on the idea that we elect other people to take care of us, not in terms of welfare checks, but in terms of passing legislation that ensures equality and justice for all. And there's been too much erosion. So,
well, and part of that is going again back to your time as lieutenant governor, and we'll get it was I think we called them. I think you later called them Capitol for a Day, but I think we called them Governor's Public Forums.
Right.
And all the department heads were going out and going into towns, every county in Montana, bringing government to Montana.
Yeah. Governor judges were restricted more to larger audiences, and not. What he tried to do was take along directors. If you went to a rural area like Glasgow, it would be pretty certain that both I and the Department of Agriculture head would be a part of the air guard plane that we flew up in. When I came up, or borrowed that same concept, but totally in line with my ideas, if they don't trust us, I'm not going to be around next time around, that sort of thing. So we set up the Capitol for a Day, and I don't remember how many we did, but we hit just about every.
I think you did every county.
Maybe. Well, I didn't do any of the large counties because my feeling was I was in large cities so often that there was ample opportunity. I believe we did do Great Falls. We got a hold of a little mobile home or something and parked it on Central Avenue, but it didn't have nearly the interest or the importance that the last one we held was in Circle, Montana. I think in their historical museum they have that sign we used to hang across the street said Capitol for Day, and I think it was a very important part again of who I was and what I was trying to accomplish. I had some great meetings, and I had once up, I think that was up at Whitefish or someplace, that some guy brought in a couple of pet wild animals like jaguars or pumas or something. They both come bounding in. This guy had that one set me back a little bit in the chair.
Tell me, and this, of course, as again was a follow-up, those governors' forums that Governor Judge did that you were part of. It was during that period that in the late, let's say 75 or so, going into 76, when you were completing 8 years as land commissioner with the land department, that you were asked to be the lieutenant governor candidate under the new constitution. Remember, we had to run as a team for the first time.
Right.
And Governor Judge asked you to run with him. Would you go into that a little bit?
I mean, I remember a meeting at the mansion in which there were a number of people there, and in the course of the conversation, this issue came up kind of strangely. I mean, because I was there, Bill Christensen, who was a possible gubernatorial candidate and that sort of thing. And I remember a comment that Governor Judge made, and I'm not sure it's an exact quote, but he said there's people in this room who are people that I'm looking at right now. And I don't remember Governor Judge's initial contact with me on that issue itself. I mean, I don't remember when he said, I want you, I don't remember that.
Some of the dynamic was that Bill Christensen was lieutenant governor, elected independently, separately under the old Constitution.
That was the last one of the
And he could either maybe team up with Tom, or maybe he could run on his own for
own,
governor.
right.
And I think
Yeah.
Bill's ambivalence on all that led
Yeah.
to Tom to look for someone
Yeah,
to run.
and I don't really know much about that campaign, but I think there were at least some friction between the Christensen lieutenant governor race and governor Judge's race in that last election in which they were separate, which
72,
probably is
yeah.
inevitable. You don't want a hostile lieutenant governor.
Right.
I mean, so I don't know that I have
One of the examples of that I like to always refer to is when Ted James was lieutenant governor for Tim Babcock, and when the Governor Babcock left the state, there was a vacancy in the Public Service Commission, and Ted James appointed Ernie Steele, his friend, onto the PSC while the governor was out of state, and that created the schism.
You just gave me a fact I didn't know before, there. So I know that later Ted challenged Governor Babcock.
But you ended up being on the team, and of course, our relationship was even more cemented in that 1976 election. I was sitting in the kind of number 2 position in the campaign, side by side with your son Mike.
Yeah.
We were sitting there with Ron Richards in the main office, and we were the campaign management of that campaign in 1976 when you and Governor Judge were running against Bob Woodall and Tony Roselle.
Right.
And won by what was kind of an astounding about 61% of the vote at that time.
I think that's because Ron Richards went down through their garbage, if I remember right.
Gee, the garbage. Was that? Well, you know that story, and I don't know. I will probably illuminate on that a little bit because that's one of the highlights.
I don't remember anything.
It's one of the highlights of my political life. But I will tell you this: I do remember that when we were confronted with the challenge, we went to your house, and you and I and Ron sat in your house that afternoon, and you came up with the idea, and you said, I think people understand someone getting in their garbage more than they understand concern about their medical records. Maybe we should talk about the garbage rather than about the records. You came up with that.
I had forgotten it, Evan, and I'm not sure I want to remember it. So
I just want to say it to assure you that many times in the room, you were the guy that came up with the idea, and even though you don't always remember that, my recollection was what an important part you were in creating
you know that a lieutenant governor candidate is simply an adjunct. What did we always used to say? That you just had to put somebody there who didn't get you into trouble. I mean, because people vote for governors really, and that I think probably is still accepted political philosophy.
What happened with that convention? They did tell the so-called powers that be, stay away from here.
Yeah.
And that included telling the Democratic Party to stay away, and I was with the Democratic Party at the time. So most of us observed that from the outside. But it was an interesting thing because when it was all said and done, it was pretty clear that the previous vested interests and powerful interests of the state didn't like it and tried to defeat it at the polls. Well, and it passed by a
you're going to need to clarify one thing. As I recall, the legislative session prior to the convention, the Constitutional Convention, had been strongly Republican, which basically removed some of their most influential people. Isn't that accurate? I seem to remember that there were a lot of people who probably would have played a much more vital role in the convention, but were already in the legislature and those people were not allowed to run for the
That's correct. They were not allowed to run for it. That was
so I think that was a factor too. It was a kind of a luck instant.
Yeah. There was an interesting coincidence that I'll just give you my take on the fact that when they were having the big sales tax debate in the 71 session, and they went through 2 special sessions afterwards, and finally they said, well, let's put it on the ballot. And they put it on the ballot and said, well, there's an election coming up in November. It was a constitutional convention. Let's attach the sales tax vote on that. And then with what Dan Foley did to expose the corporate dominance of the sales tax effort right before that election that occurred, that there was such an overwhelming turnout to vote against the sales tax, 71% voted against it. And it had been so identified with the Republicans that suddenly you had a constitutional convention that was almost 2/3 Democratic members and progressive independent members sometimes. And so out of the idea of the progressive constitution Montana has is almost an accident of electoral politics of the convergence of the sales tax vote and the con vote in the same day. Day. But you suddenly were lieutenant governor in after the '76 election. And I remember that so well. It was such a big happy day when you run campaigns and you work heavy in campaigns, as Mike and I did with Ron and everything. It's a big deal when you win them. And it's like, what else do we do with our lives when this is over? That being said, you had now a new role as lieutenant governor. Reflect upon that, because those were 4 years that were probably challenging.
Well, and I don't remember exactly how it happened, because obviously as lieutenant governor, at least in my case, I had pretty frequent contact with Governor Judge, I mean, over one thing or another. And I think because I had come out of a resource agency, some way I wound up with the sort of chair responsibility for dealing with resource issues and then providing their input and my recommendations to the governor. I mean, it's a very simple government procedure. And so much of that 4-year period was occupied with fish and game people like Poswitz and natural resources and that sort of thing. But that was the major focus. I mean, I did some speaking on issues, sometimes without the governor's input, and sometimes, he asked me to go to talk to people. We had some events then that I can't place them chronologically, but when the energy crisis hit under Carter, we had a real problem with truckers, for example, who couldn't, are delivering all the goods we eat every day, and they're having real problems, not only getting fuel, but the prices had exploded, of course. So I did a little bit of that troubleshooting, I guess you'd call it. And I remember I went over, I met with a very angry group of truckers out south of Missoula someplace, down around Lolo or something, and they were irate, there was no question. I mean, they were very frustrated. So, no, but mostly the major role I played was to try to put together recommendations to the governor that might apply to a wilderness bill that was being fought over in Congress, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and that was the time in which under the energy crisis, when the threat of supposedly maybe 80 power plants in eastern Montana, the federal government had a report that said that, and Ross Toole wrote The Rape of the Great Plains. Everyone was fearful about all this development coming in, and that was part of the context of what you were doing at the time.
Yeah, I don't know how far that had advanced. I mean, I really didn't get into the hot seat until, they transferred the reclamation responsibility. Well, actually, the passage of the reclamation legislation, coupled with the recently passed Environmental Protection Act, put me into the hottest seat, even including the governorship, in terms of publicity, which may have later helped me as a candidate for governor, but was literally driving me crazy because of the explosion of interest in whether or not we wanted to see those 20 power plants, whether we wanted to ship coal to Asia, port out on the West Coast. All of that stuff came while I was down there, and I wound up in the Denver Post and national magazines, international. They were talking about Montana has always enjoyed sort of a reputation of a place that you look for once in a while for a really unique story, And it became the focus of environmental concern nationally. A lot of the people who came in here, who lobbied, against the coal industry and for the reclamation, came from out of state. They came out of West Virginia. They came out of Kentucky. I got to know some of them. Some of those people later were very critical parts of my campaign. They were very supportive of me when I made the primary challenge in 1980. But there was an environmental explosion, which again relates to Constitution, to laws that were passed, to prospective damages to the state of Montana.
But it's almost like, in some sense, deja vu all over again. A lot of those very issues you just mentioned come to the fore right now. Transportation of coal to Asia, going through the ports, the challenge of that.
Right.
So we seem to come back full circle on a lot of these things. And
well, as I say, they gave the land department, which had historically just been a land management agency of some 5 million plus acres of forest and prairie and agricultural land. And all of a sudden, first of all, they pass legislation which requires the implementation of staff, and the environmental movement was so new. Who do you hire?
Yeah.
Where do you find? Where do you go from here? At least from that point of view of being totally new in Montana, we just walked out into totally foreign territory when we got into the reclamation business. And it was always exacerbated by the history of the Anaconda Company and the other mining and forest industry in Montana. But anyway, one by one, I tried to bring people in, very small staff, because the legislature, as usual, in an executive branch, always asks you to do a lot, but they're very reluctant to give you money. You know, at least that's what directors claim, whether it's right or wrong. But anyway. In some respects, it was I'm going to use the word exciting. I mean, in a way, I enjoyed it. I didn't like all the publicity. I really didn't, because it was distracting. I mean, I didn't like calls from CBS in New York or something like that. Are you really going to do these kinds of things? But on the other hand, it certainly livened up things in the relatively staid old state land department, and in retrospect, I mean, I survived. I mean, we find a lot of people because we were all struggling to make it work, and at least in the coal area, I feel comfortable with what we were able to accomplish. I mean, we had some criticism and probably deserved it. But,
well, there's something to be said for coming out of the crucible a little stronger than you were, the alloyed perhaps, a little stronger.
Yeah.
And that might, as you said earlier, maybe prepared you well for dealing with running on your own.
Well, the problem with the reclamation issue, of course, is that it was new and it was hot. I mean, it was, I had reporters who came down, usually on Friday sometime in the afternoon, who wanted to know who'd been fined lately, are you having any recent problems, and that sort of thing. That's rare, in relations with the media. So it was implemented, and hopefully it's still working well, because we still have coal industry, and
we still have coal, we still have a MEPA,
right,
we still have reclamation laws, we still have development challenges. Now, there have been some weakening of some of those laws. During that time we were talking about, which was a difficult time in terms of government, you just spoke about the challenges of the department and the natural resource areas and what was going on. But then there was that other challenge of, well, what do I do with my life next? Do I run for governor?
Right.
What's going on?
Okay.
And you had a sitting governor who couldn't figure out what he was going to do as far as a third term, which is only happened once in Montana history.
Yeah.
A third term. So tell us about that kind of time, because it was certainly a transitional time for you.
No question. And we don't have enough time, unless we've got hours, to talk about the process of making a decision of that magnitude. I mean, I'm not going to fool you one bit. I mean, it's not an easy decision to make, because you first have to make it at the family level, and you have to make it at the personal level, and then ultimately you finally get around to worrying about the political level. So I don't know how to summarize it. I guess the easiest way, Evan, is that something happened in 79 session. people like Carol Graham, who was an old friend, very conservative rancher from down in southeastern Montana, and some very liberal Democratic members of the House and Senate would occasionally trickle down to the Lieutenant Governor's office, which is just down the hall, from the Governor's office. And they made a pitch. The purpose of the visit was to make 2 points. One, they did not believe that Governor Judge could be reelected. And they felt that I represented a candidate who could possibly, I don't know that they were all that enthusiastic. Some of them were, like Carol was a very good personal friend, but given that they had already concluded that a third term for Governor Judge would be very, very difficult, if not impossible, they were asking me to run. And I'm not going to talk personalities except for Carol, who's long gone, unfortunately. But anyway, it gets you thinking. It does. And I had some contacts during that summer of people who called or stopped by see me, and I don't know when the final decision was really made. By the time the Democratic Convention met in Great Falls, I appeared there and made a speech. Governor Judge was in Japan, I think, Japan or China. And they'd asked me I was asked to comment on it. I said, I've given it consideration. I can tell you that if I do get elected, I will work very hard to strengthen the Democratic Party, which then was nothing like it is today, which is well funded and has great technical expertise and so forth. And I said, if one of the things I will do is on any contribution, I believe it was over $500, I will give some portion of it to the Democratic Party to help all other candidates. And I said I wouldn't make any decision until the governor came back. The decision, in large part, was determined by a headline in the Independent Record, which said that some of my staff and a fellow by the name of Dave Hunter, who later became my campaign manager, had met down at the Lewis and Clark Library. And the headline the next morning, which caught me by surprise, said, Schwinden supporters asked for a statewide draft Schwinden, something like that. I mean, that's not the exact, but anyway, that really put the heat on. And that was, I'm not even sure, probably late October, November, I think, probably. So from that time on, it started going pretty rapidly because within the 2 days, Dick Bennett in Great Falls had formed a draft. Then one of my former legislative friends called me from the Kalispell, Libby area, and he was putting together. So
the grassroots was speaking out.
I mean, you have no more negotiating room. It's either go or don't go. Right. It's that simple. Followed by a series of long talk with Gene through this whole process, calling all three of our offspring, and even then, we finally had a meeting down in the basement of our house up on Highland, and we went. Dave Hunter was there, who I hadn't even known before all this started, but I had gotten good recommendations on his past experience, and
he had been involved with us in the '78 Williams campaign.
Right, and he came with his all too familiar easel and butcher paper and drew the T and Tom and Ted across the top and laid out what he thought were the pros and cons, that sort of thing. But then they wanted to know if any of us who were assembled there that evening had anything that if I ran would be, cause a real problem to the campaign, and everybody self-evaluated and concluded that we didn't have a problem there. And I didn't still decide that night, but it was, I probably was leaning. I'm sure what happened is after it was over, Gene and I probably went upstairs and had a long visit. And I'm not sure when I announced. I announced down in that same Lewis and Clark library down here. But I don't remember what date.
But you were clearly running before the sitting governor, Tom Judge, had resolved what he was going to do, and in fact, he kept waiting and waiting.
Oh, I waited
and waiting.
until he got back because
But
I don't want to. I went up to, I had said I wouldn't
Yeah.
do it until he came back. I got an appointment as soon as he got back, within a day or two, and I went in and I said that I had made a decision I was going to run, and he said that's fine, and then he said something to the effect, and I can't quote him, but to the fact that fine and dandy, but you're not going to win. It said it a little blunter than that, I think. But anyhow, by then the die was cast. We had made some analysis of how much money we'd have to raise and that sort of thing. And obviously one of the key issues was how quickly the governor would, if I were to announce, how quickly he would announce. And as you know, he delayed significantly. He wrote letters statewide to his supporters and gave us some very valuable time to put together a fundraising effort, to put together a staff, to put together an office location downtown, to consult an awful lot of people of, where they were at on this whole thing. So we had some breathing room until right around the first of the year, I guess it was. And it was shortly after that after looking at quite a few people, I asked George to come aboard. We had lunch together here. I think he was enthusiastic. I think he'd been mayor of Missoula, and the fact that he'd been a Republican mayor was irrelevant to me because he'd developed a pretty good reputation among Democrats over in the Missoula area. So that's how it all happened.
You had the energy and enthusiasm and freshness and newness and so on, but for whatever reason it was...
I had 3 children who gave up their jobs to come and work in the campaign in critical areas, and I had already obviously contacted some of the people that I had needed their support, and we had also begun to attract volunteers who I hadn't known before who were enthusiastic. So
you got the nomination. And when a lieutenant governor,
right.
When you're trying for a 3rd term, again, John Erickson's the only Montana governor to ever serve the 3 terms consecutively like that.
Yeah.
And he barely made it the 3rd time. And so that 3rd term is pretty tough to do in Montana.
Well, Evan, that's not what polling shows. I mean, I did enough polling and I saw enough of governor judges that indicated 3rd term is not really a relevant.
It wasn't the issue. Yeah.
No, it's not even an important issue. I mean, it still comes down to trust, character, performance.
Okay.
I mean, those just overwhelm everything else. Yeah. And, your ability to campaign, and Tom Governor Judge was a good campaigner. Right. I mean, he worked hard at it. In fact, I remember the last day of the governor, when I was running lieutenant governor, we were up at Black Eagle, we had dinner together. And I'm just exhausted. I mean, we'd just been going steady. And I said, I'm heading back to Helena. And he said, I'm going down. There's some bowling alleys that are still open right now. So he headed down to the bowling alleys. Yeah. So, I mean, he wanted the job. There's no question in my mind. I mean, he was a good campaigner.
When I say the 3rd term is tough, it doesn't mean it's the issue of the 3rd term so much as maybe by that time people said, time for a change or whatever,
That could be in there. I don't know.
But you were elected and in the primary.
One of the most difficult aspects of that whole process is the fact that even on the day before the election, on Monday before the election, the most optimistic news that appeared throughout that whole campaign had always assumed that I didn't have a chance. Chuck Ronson, I believe it was, wrote an article that said, while everyone believes that Governor Judge his administration will be reelected, some people do say that it could be close. I mean, we ran against that the whole way through, that I like Ted, but there's no way you can, we all knew what had happened to Ted James, when he tackled Governor Babcock. That's a tough thing when you're campaigning. I mean, the only thing that helped us in that respect, and we've been talking about running for governor and that sort of thing, is that our family believed, beginning in about mid-May, And for me personally, I don't know about Dore and Chris and Mike who were on the trail, particularly Mike down in that area, but I worked the smelter where they change clothes, you know,
Change house, change
yeah,
room,
right.
Okay.
And when I came out of there that day, out of that place, I believed that I had won the primary. There obviously were hundreds of other factors, but I'm also in the most democratic part of the state of Montana, and in the primary, you know, the party people are the most important.
Well,
So I wanted to make that point that in many respects we did, because of the help of the art community, which is crucial to my campaign. Their generosity is that you know, we were running against this idea that we like him, but he can't win. You know, that's a tough one.
Well, it's
I
tough
think
when-
any underdog has that.
I suspect it's tough when you are campaigning to be
Yeah,
running into
yeah,
that, you know,
yeah,
to
yeah.
get yourself up for the next day. But by the way, having located over in Butte and gotten separated from the Helena political scene, I was one of those people watching it going on.
I figured I'd lose.
No, I
I'll
figured,
bet you did.
no, I figured you had it. I figured you had it. That was the feel in Butte.
Okay.
That
well,
was the feel in Butte. And it wasn't the
but
feel
you know, the only real ties I had with Butte is I spent a year at the School of Mines, and I was married there.
Yeah.
That's my Butte roots,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah.
So, but anyway, this is kind of irrelevant. But no, that in terms of the campaign itself, other than the always problem of begging for money, which we all hated, is the fact that we were always running against a public perception that it was an unwinnable race. So one of the problems we had in the general that fall was not necessarily just Jack Ramirez. It's that all of a sudden now people figured, well, he can win anything, you know, if he can come out of that primary. So that was that was a factor that probably helped us in the fall campaign against Jack, who, by the way, was, you know, an ideal gentleman in terms of Gene and I met, he and his wife, many times out in parades and so forth. We did something like 25 or 26 debate, believe it or not, all the way out to Jordan, Montana. And neither Jack or I ever pulled a cheapie, you know, and the thing. In fact, we had done a debate in downtown Billings in the afternoon, and that night we were out at the Rocky campus for another one, and Jack and I got out there both at the same time, eyes red, absolutely worn out, and we kind of quietly decided between ourselves that we just weren't going to go on the attack tonight. We were going to make it a very sociable kind of exchange with the student body. So no, he was a good candidate, but I think the momentum of the primary really helped, Evan. I really do.
And you ended up in a 55-45 win.
Yeah,
which is
yeah,
fairly substantial.
Yeah. I mean,
that's a
you know, for a guy who had no one who believed he was going to win, I mean, that was a shocker. I mean, it really was a shocker. So
pendulum that often swings in politics to control from one party to another. And I often think that the art form is, once the pendulum's out on your side, you want to try to keep it there. And your election bridged it from a 12-year Democratic governorship reign to 20. A phenomenal stretch.
yeah, well, I think maybe what helped me, you know, even into the second term was the surprise of the election in '80. I mean, that I actually won.
Well, considering the Reagan thing.
The what?
Ronald Reagan's
Right.
election and what was
Not a
happening.
guy to run against.
Yeah.
No, or in the same
Election.
ballot
yeah.
way. No, but that pretty much sums it up. I mean, unlike Governor Judge when he was first elected, if my memory serves me correctly, I only kept two people, Gordon McComber and Leo Barry, I think, and put in. I had to let some very good friends go, but they chose the other side, and you know the rules of politics. So,
Well, you know, those were difficult things. We all know
sure,
that.
I know
because,
that. I know.
You know,
that.
we were a poker club together, a lot of us.
Yeah. No.
But that being said, you know, you brought your own administration in. You started to do
Yeah.
things your way. That's what governorship is about.
Sure.
And
Well, as we talked a little earlier about once the reclamation issue became front page news, why I certainly picked up. I had seen a poll that was taken probably when Tom was looking for a lieutenant governor candidate, in which I had a name recognition of 11, 12%, something like that. Harold Gerke and I were almost tied. Yeah. So, but anyway, it's a, I mean, the governor is, or a statewide office, that's why we traditionally move attorney general or someone like that up, because they have that great visibility.
But we don't call those tier 2 for nothing.
The what?
Tier B races. The other statewide officials, as important as they are, shrink next to the governorship in terms of the visibility and people looking at you and wanting stuff to happen.
No, and that's I mean, it's the most important. Well, protocol-wise, it's the second most important office in the United States, behind the president.
There's only 50 of them.
No, it's a great role. I really enjoyed the 8 years. I had a lot of good people working for me, and I wound up with one of the reporters saying that he did it without a hint of scandal, and I thought that was a nice accolade.
Well, when you run on the basis of straight talk, good people, and when it's all done,
you better
they
behave.
Say that, I mean, a mission accomplished.
I felt good, and I also felt good the day I walked out of the Capitol. Mm-hmm. And I really only was back one time after that, Evan. I had committed to the Fort Peck not Fort Peck, the Salish and Kootenai tribe. We had developed a sort of a treaty between them and our Fish, Wildlife, and Parks on joint control of hunting and fishing over on the reservation. And I had the chairman or tribal chairman had asked for my commitment that I would come in and speak on behalf of it. So I did that. I did it before Senator James's committee, and so that was my second walk out of the Capitol, and from that point on, that was it. I have enjoyed. Gina and I had some of our best years after I left office. For a long time, we commuted between here and Arizona, where we had one time a son and then later on a daughter. I think we probably had planned to continue that, but then in 2004, Jean was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and we had a difficult 2+ years, and sort of the hope of what we had considered just didn't materialize, as life sometimes happens. So, but no complaints at all.
I know, looking at your governorship, it was during that time in 1984 when I was selected to be on the Democratic National Committee.
Right.
And so I served 12 years there, and it was in that role that I remember meeting with you in the governor's house, Bruce Nelson, myself, you, and a number of your key people when you were formulating the Build Montana program, which was put on the ballot as a way to take your message of economic development and make it part and parcel of your '84 campaign. It became part of the ballot issue and passed overwhelmingly. And as a practitioner, by the way, of economic development for 18 years and 25 years, frankly, those basic tools still serve Montana well. I know, because I deal with them all the time, but Build Montana was one of the signature pieces for you in your administration.
Well, it was almost a sort of passage, because I was over in the Capitol that night for some reason, and I couldn't believe the line of people lined up to test. I mean, it was, business, labor, virtually all of the so-called lobby groups in Montana were very supportive. So getting the legislation passed once it had been sold to this was fairly easy.
It's been a wonderful conversation here, thinking of the 30 years, that great period of change.
Easier for you than me.
But thank God you're here to tell what went on.
Thanks, Evan.
Really, and what a phenomenal era of change, a quiet revolution, a transformational period. In summary, how would you encapsulate the driving forces that led to a changed Montana?
Well, early on, I said that there's always a tendency to forget that our demographics and our our cultural ideology changed with the return of the veterans from World War II. So we had a new group of people who probably were looking for some change in the direction to go. And then this series of events that we've explored this morning began to be triggered. The old coalitions, corporate coalitions, began to weaken and eventually disappear. The Anaconda Company disappeared from the face of Montana. All of a sudden, we had ARCO and Dennis Washington. You know, I mean, that's a revolution.
Well, we went from
for Butte, at least
10,000 underground miners to 350 surface miners.
Right.
What a change.
So we had that. We had the development of an independent press, which I can't emphasize enough is essential to decent and honest, responsible government. You just have to have somebody looking into what's going on in government. That period in which Governor Anderson ran, the sales tax initiative was put on the ballot, and the devastating loss of that to the Republican Party, which made it, as it turned out, possible for Democrats to control the governorship, which is the most important political post, if not the most important governmental post in the state. Particularly essential because it's about the time that all of a sudden the legislature is feeling its oats. And they're saying, hey, I mean, don't forget about us. And so they rapidly proceed not only to set up the legislative council, they set up a legislative auditor and a fiscal analyst to start giving governors sometimes a lot of problems.
Yeah,
I mean, and they're they're looking at agencies that they feel are not operating properly. So that was important. And then all of a sudden, in the midst of all this, bam, we get a constitutional convention, which nobody else in the country is talking or thinking about. Ours is goes back to statehood, and there's enough public enthusiasm to have a referendum, and we create a new constitution, which I think by any rational standard it would be called progressive, environmental emphasis, civil rights emphasis, that sort of thing.
Often considered the best in America right now.
Yeah. And then at about the same time, in part because of the battle over the sales tax, Governor Anderson comes in with a pledge to reorganize state government and brought along with that the reorganization or the redirection of the state financing operation through the State Investment Board. And we hardly got rid of those 440-yard hurdles, and all of a sudden we get the new reclamation environmental push. So Evan, if that's not a revolution in government, I don't know what is. Not in terms of, we didn't have a militia shooting anybody, but we had a population that some way or another was willing to take some big risks in improving their government. And I believe to this day that if you add up that list of items, you come up with the conclusion that it was all to the good. If you've been around Montana government, particularly in that period, you got to be damn proud of it. I mean, proud of the people who made it all happen, really. And like I said, I mean, for most of the time I was sort of sitting on the sidelines watching this thing, and it wasn't until I'd been out of office for 3 or 4 years in the quiet solitude of my home and family that it began to dawn on me what had happened. You know, it's like a ton of bricks fell on you. I mean, it ain't the same anymore. If that legislator from the 40s or 30s or 50s came now, they would be stunned. I can't believe it, so. Well, I've enjoyed the opportunity to reflect with you on this, and I hope your students get some benefit from it. We have to keep talking about Montana history and understanding who we are and where we came from.
Well, I want to thank you for taking the time to do it, number one. Number two, you're, as I would expect, self-effacing about your role in this. And yet, I will say this, that...
Look, I mean, I got campaigned on a straight talk. I mean, I still believe that much of what I did, much of this stuff really took place while I was I was watching the game, but Coach only called me in a little later on, you know.
Well, there are a lot of, we've talked in our classes about forces and people. And we talked earlier about when opportunity presents, to be there to do something when opportunity presents itself. And there's been a lot of it. You were there for a lot of the things that happened.
Yes.
And you played a role. You're letting our students and others know that role, and your sense of it is very, very important. And I want to thank you at as a professional, historical level, but also as a friend. Thank you.
Very good, very good.